The bus rattles through darkness on a winding Tennessee road, its headlights cutting through fog that clings to the Appalachian ridges like wet wool. Inside, 23 women sit in silence, their faces pale in the dim overhead light, their hands clutched around purses and lunch pails. It is March 1944, 4 in the morning, and they are traveling to work at a place that does not exist. They do not know where they are going. They do not know what they will do when they arrive. They have been told only that it is war work, essential work, and that they must never speak of it to anyone, not even each other, not even in sleep. The bus turns off the main highway onto an unmarked dirt road, and a soldier steps from the guardhouse with a rifle across his chest. He boards without smiling, checks each woman's badge under a flashlight beam, and waves the driver forward. Through the windows, the women see only trees and darkness and the red taillights of another bus ahead. Somewhere beyond the ridges, a town is being born in secret, a city built to do something no one will name, and these women are part of it whether they understand or not. This place is called Oak Ridge, though it will not appear on any map of the United States until the war is over. It is a city conjured from mud and classified blueprints, erected in 18 months across 59,000 acres of East Tennessee wilderness. Before 1942, this land was home to scattered farms, churchyards, and families who had lived here for generations, growing tobacco and corn in the shadow of Black Oak Ridge. Then the government arrived with trucks and surveyors and polite men in dark suits who said the land was needed for the war effort and that everyone had 30 days to leave. The families packed what they could carry and watched as bulldozers tore through their fields and buried their ancestors' graves under fresh dirt. By the spring of 1943, the largest construction project in American history was underway, a city rising faster than anyone thought possible, built to do one thing, produce the fissile material for an atomic bomb. But no one who lived there knew that. Not the welders, not the chemists, not the secretaries or the janitors or the thousands of young women who operated the machines. They knew only what they were told, which was almost nothing. Oak Ridge was a secret so tightly held that even the people inside it did not know what they were building. The Army called it the Clinton Engineer Works, a name so vague it could have meant anything. Workers were given badges color-coded by clearance level and told to stay within their designated areas. Guards with dogs patrolled the perimeter fences. Mail was opened and read by censors before it left the city. Phone calls were monitored. Conversations in cafeterias and dormitories were reported. To speak carelessly was to risk dismissal or arrest. To ask questions was to invite suspicion. And so 75,000 people lived and worked in a place that officially did not exist, building something they could not name for reasons they were forbidden to know. The scale of Oak Ridge was staggering. Within a year it became the fifth largest city in Tennessee, though it appeared on no census and no road map. Streets were laid out in grids, numbered and lettered like a military grid. Dormitories rose in rows, housing thousands of workers who slept in shifts so the beds would never be empty. There were schools and churches and movie theaters and a hospital, all enclosed within the perimeter. There were buses that ran every 15 minutes, carrying workers to the plants where the real work happened, the work that mattered, the work that hummed through the night with a sound like distant thunder. The plants themselves were massive, windowless structures lit by floodlights and surrounded by double fences topped with barbed wire. Inside, row after row of machines stretched into the distance, operated by women in shifts around the clock. The machines were called calotrons, though the workers did not know what that word meant. They were told only to watch the dials, turn the knobs, keep the needles steady. Do not ask what the machines do. Do not speak to the woman beside you. Do not write down anything you see. The women who came to Oak Ridge were mostly young, mostly from rural Tennessee and Kentucky and the Carolinas, places where jobs were scarce and the war felt distant and abstract. They answered advertisements that promised good wages and clean housing and the chance to serve their country. They arrived by bus and train, carrying suitcases and hope, and they were met by soldiers who checked their names against lists and handed them badges and maps. They were assigned dormitories, given uniforms, told to report to orientation at 6 in the morning. The orientation was brief and vague. You will operate equipment vital to the war effort. You will follow procedures exactly as instructed. You will not discuss your work with anyone, ever. Failure to comply will result in immediate termination and possible prosecution. Do you understand? They nodded, though they did not understand, not really. But the pay was good, better than anything they could earn back home, and the work seemed simple enough. Turn the dial, watch the needle, write down the numbers. How hard could it be? Harder than they imagined. The calotrons were machines designed to separate isotopes of uranium, a process called electromagnetic separation, though none of the operators knew that term or what it meant. The machines required constant attention, precise adjustments, a steady hand, and a patient eye. The work was tedious and exhausting, 12-hour shifts in a building with no windows and air so thick with heat and chemical smells that some women fainted at their stations. They stood at control panels lined with dials and meters and switches, their hands moving in practiced rhythms, adjusting voltages and magnetic fields without understanding why. They were trained to recognize patterns, to respond to deviations, to keep the process stable, but they were never told what the process was. They were never told that the machines were separating uranium-235 from uranium-238, enriching the lighter isotope to a concentration high enough to sustain a nuclear chain reaction. They were never told that the numbers they recorded every hour represented the accumulation of bomb-grade material, gram by gram, shift by shift, day by day. Some of them wondered. In the dormitories at night, they whispered to each other in the dark. "What do you think we're making?" One woman said she thought it was a new kind of fuel. Another said she heard it was something to do with electricity. A third said she didn't care as long as the paycheck cleared. But there were others who felt the weight of the secrecy, the strangeness of it all, the way the guards watched them, the way the mail took weeks to arrive, and when it did, whole sentences were blacked out. The way people disappeared sometimes, workers who asked too many questions or talked too freely, and no one would say where they went or why. There was a fear that settled over Oak Ridge like the fog in the valleys, a fear that kept people silent even when they wanted to speak. You learned not to look at the person beside you. You learned to eat your meals quickly and return to your dormitory without stopping to talk. You learned that in a place of secrets, trust was a luxury you could not afford. And yet life went on. There were dances on Saturday nights in the recreation hall, live bands playing swing music while couples spun across the floor. There were baseball games in the summer, workers cheering for teams with names like the Bombers and the Rockets, names chosen without irony or awareness. There were weddings in the chapel, young couples married in haste because the war made everything feel urgent and fragile. There were births in the hospital, babies who would grow up never knowing that they were born in a city that did not exist, a city built to end a war by unleashing a force no one fully understood. The people of Oak Ridge lived ordinary lives in an extraordinary place, and most of them did not realize how strange that was until it was over. The scientists knew. The engineers knew. The men in the administrative buildings who pored over blueprints and production reports, who calculated yields and timelines and the probability of success, they knew what was being built. But they were a small fraction of the population, sequestered in their own areas, forbidden from discussing their work even with each other unless it was necessary. The director of the Oak Ridge facility was a man named Colonel Kenneth Nichols, a military engineer who reported directly to General Leslie Groves, the head of the Manhattan Project. Nichols understood the stakes. He understood that the Germans were working on their own atomic weapon, that the race was not metaphorical, but literal, and that failure was not an option. He understood that the secrecy was not paranoia, but necessity, that loose lips did not just sink ships, but could lose the war. And so, he enforced the rules with ruthless efficiency. Anyone who violated security protocols was removed immediately. Anyone who asked too many questions was transferred or discharged. The workers were told only what they needed to know, which was almost nothing, and that was by design. The compartmentalization was total. The Calitron operators did not know that the gaseous diffusion workers in another part of the facility were doing the same thing they were, just by a different method. The gaseous diffusion plant, codenamed K-25, was an even larger structure, a building so vast it covered 44 acres under one roof, the largest building in the world at the time. Inside, uranium hexafluoride gas was pumped through thousands of barriers with microscopic pores, each stage separating the lighter isotope from the heavier one by a fraction of a percent. It was a slow process, inefficient but reliable, and it ran continuously, day and night, fed by a power supply so enormous that the plant consumed more electricity than most American cities. The workers who maintained the pumps and valves and compressors did not know what the gas was or why it mattered. They knew only that it was dangerous, that leaks could be fatal, and that their job was to keep the system running no matter what. And it did run. By the summer of 1945, Oak Ridge was producing enriched uranium at a rate sufficient to fuel a bomb. The material was shipped in small unmarked containers to Los Alamos, New Mexico, where it was assembled into a weapon called Little Boy, a gun-type device that would detonate when two subcritical masses of uranium-235 were fired into each other at high speed. The scientists at Los Alamos tested a different design, a plutonium implosion bomb called Fat Man, in the New Mexico desert on July 16, 1945, and the test was successful beyond anyone's expectations. The flash of light was visible for miles. The mushroom cloud rose 7 miles into the sky. The shockwave shattered windows in towns 30 miles away. And in Oak Ridge, no one knew. The workers went about their shifts as usual, turning dials and recording numbers and wondering when the war would end. They found out on August 6, 1945. That morning, a B-29 bomber called the Enola Gay dropped Little Boy on Hiroshima, Japan. The bomb detonated at an altitude of 1,900 feet directly above the city center, and in an instant, 70,000 people were dead. Buildings were vaporized. Fires spread across miles of wreckage. Survivors wandered through the ruins, their skin hanging in sheets, their eyes burned blind. And in Oak Ridge, the workers gathered around radios and heard the news. President Truman's voice crackled through the static, measured and firm. "We have used a new weapon," he said, "a weapon of unprecedented power, a weapon that harnesses the basic force of the universe." And he named the place where it was made, Oak Ridge, Tennessee. The secret city, the invisible city, the city that 75,000 people had built without knowing what they were building. The reaction was complex. There was pride, certainly, a sense of accomplishment, of being part of something monumental. There was relief that the war might finally end, that their sons and brothers and husbands might come home. But there was also shock, a slow dawning horror as the scale of destruction became clear. The women who had operated the Calatrons sat in the dormitories and stared at each other in silence. "We did that," one of them whispered. "We made that." And the weight of it settled over them like ash. They had spent 2 years turning dials and watching needles, and now they knew what those actions meant. They had separated atoms. They had enriched uranium. They had built a bomb that killed a city. In the days that followed, more details emerged. The newspapers ran photographs of Hiroshima, images so devastating that many people could not look at them for long. The city was gone, reduced to rubble and shadow. Survivors described a flash brighter than the sun, a heat that melted skin and metal, a wind that tore buildings from their foundations. And then the radiation, the invisible poison that lingered in the soil and water and bodies, killing slowly over weeks and months. The death toll climbed, 70,000, 80,000, 90,000. And 3 days after Hiroshima, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki, a plutonium bomb built with material from another secret facility in Hanford, Washington. 40,000 more dead. And then finally, Japan surrendered. The war was over. Oak Ridge erupted in celebration. The streets filled with people dancing and singing and crying with relief. The secrecy was lifted, at least partially. Newspapers across the country ran stories about the secret city, the invisible city, the place that had been hidden for 3 years and had just changed the world. Reporters arrived in droves, interviewing workers and taking photographs of the plants in the dormitories and the rows of identical houses. The workers were finally allowed to talk about what they had done, though many of them found they did not know how. How do you explain that you built a bomb without knowing you were building a bomb? How do you reconcile pride and guilt, triumph and horror, the joy of peace and the cost of achieving it? For some, the pride was uncomplicated. They had served their country, they had ended the war, they had saved lives by shortening the conflict, by making an invasion of Japan unnecessary. This was the narrative promoted by the government, by the military, by President Truman himself. The bomb had been a terrible necessity, a weapon used to prevent even greater loss of life. And many people believed that. They had to believe it because the alternative was unbearable. But others struggled. A woman named Helen Hall, who had operated a Calutron for 2 years, later said she felt like she had blood on her hands. "I didn't know," she said in an interview decades later. "But does that matter? I was part of it. I made it happen." Another worker, a man named Hank Nelson, said he could not shake the image of Hiroshima, the photographs of children with burned faces and empty eyes. "We were told it was for the war effort," he said, "and we believed it, but nobody told us it would look like that." The scientists grappled with their own guilt. Many of the physicists and chemists who had worked on the Manhattan Project felt profound unease about what they had created. Some, like J. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientific director at Los Alamos, quoted the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Others, like Leo Szilard, who had helped initiate the American atomic program, later spent years advocating for nuclear disarmament and international control of atomic weapons. They understood, in a way the workers at Oak Ridge did not, the true implications of what had been built. They understood that the atomic bomb was not just a weapon, but a threshold, a line crossed into a new kind of warfare, a new kind of world. And Oak Ridge, the city that had been secret for so long, was now famous, but the fame was uneasy. The government wanted to celebrate Oak Ridge as a triumph of American ingenuity and industrial might, a symbol of what the nation could achieve when it put its collective will toward a goal. But the reality was more complicated. Oak Ridge was a place built on displacement, on the forced removal of families from their land. It was a place built on secrecy, on the deliberate ignorance of its own workers. It was a place built to produce a weapon that killed more people in seconds than any weapon in human history. And it was a place that would never be the same. In the months after the war, the population of Oak Ridge began to decline. Workers left in waves, returning to the lives they had put on hold. The dormitories emptied, the buses ran less frequently. The plants continued to operate, but at a reduced capacity, no longer driven by the urgency of war. The government debated what to do with the facility, whether to shut it down or convert it to peacetime use. Eventually, Oak Ridge became a center for nuclear research, a place where scientists studied atomic energy and its applications beyond weapons. The Atomic Energy Commission took over management from the military, and the city slowly transitioned from a wartime boomtown to a more permanent settlement. Streets were paved, permanent houses replaced the temporary structures, schools and parks were built. Oak Ridge became a real city, not just a secret one. But the secrecy never entirely disappeared. Even after the war, parts of Oak Ridge remained classified, restricted areas where work continued on nuclear weapons and other sensitive projects. The culture of silence persisted. People learned not to talk about their work, not to ask too many questions, not to discuss what happened behind the fences. And the fences remained, still topped with barbed wire, still patrolled by guards, still marking the boundary between the known and the unknown. For the families who had been displaced, there was no return. Their land was gone, swallowed by the facility, and the government offered no apology and little compensation. Some families fought in court for years, seeking fair payment for what had been taken. Others simply moved on, scattered to other parts of Tennessee and beyond, carrying with them the memory of what had been lost. Their farms, their homes, their cemeteries, all of it buried under roads and buildings and the weight of national security. The environmental cost was also staggering, though it would not be fully understood for decades. The process of enriching uranium and processing other nuclear materials produced vast amounts of radioactive waste. Some of it was stored in tanks and ponds. Some of it was buried in shallow pits. Some of it simply leaked into the soil and groundwater. The Clinch River, which ran near the facility, became contaminated with mercury and other toxins used in the separation processes. Fish in the river carried dangerous levels of heavy metals. The air around the plants carried traces of radioactive particles. Workers were exposed to radiation levels far higher than what would later be considered safe, though at the time the dangers were not well understood. Many of them would develop cancers and other illnesses years later, illnesses that could not be definitively linked to their work but that haunted them nonetheless. In 1999, the Department of Energy issued a report acknowledging that workers at Oak Ridge and other Manhattan Project sites had been exposed to dangerous levels of radiation and toxic materials. The government established a compensation program for workers who could prove their illnesses were work-related, but the burden of proof was high, and many claims were denied. For the workers who had spent years wondering if their health problems were connected to their time at Oak Ridge, the acknowledgement was both validating and heartbreaking. We were right, they said. It was the work that made us sick, and the government knew, or should have known, and they let it happen anyway. Helen Hall died in 2003 at the age of 81. She had worked at Oak Ridge for 3 years during the war and had lived in the area for the rest of her life. In her final interview, conducted by a local historian, she was asked if she regretted her work. She was silent for a long time, staring out the window at the mountains that surrounded Oak Ridge, the same mountains she had looked at every day for 60 years. Finally, she said, "I don't know. We thought we were doing the right thing. We thought we were helping. But I don't know. How can you ever really know?" Hank Nelson lived until 2011. He had left Oak Ridge after the war and moved to North Carolina, where he worked as a teacher and never spoke about his time at the facility. His children did not learn he had worked on the bomb until after his death, when they found a box of photographs and documents in his attic. Among them was a letter he had written but never sent, addressed to no one, dated August 1945. In it, he described the day he learned what he had been building. "I felt like I had been lied to," he wrote, "like we all had. They used us and didn't tell us what for, and now I have to live with knowing I helped kill all those people. I don't know if I can." The photographs of Oak Ridge from that era are haunting. Black and white images of women in overalls standing in front of calutrons, their faces serious and tired. Images of the plants at night, floodlit and massive, steam rising from cooling towers into the dark sky. Images of the dormitories, rows of identical buildings stretching into the distance, anonymous and sterile. Images of the town itself, a place that looks like any other small American city but is not, a place built for a single purpose and shaped by that purpose in ways that cannot be undone. Today, Oak Ridge still exists. The population is around 30,000, a fraction of what it was during the war. The WWII National Security Complex still operates, still produces components for nuclear weapons, still employs thousands of people who work behind fences and cannot talk about what they do. The old Calitron building is gone, demolished decades ago, but the site remains, a fenced-off area marked with signs warning of contamination. The gaseous diffusion plant, K-25, was torn down in the 2010s, the largest demolition project in American history, a building so vast it took years to dismantle. The Clinch River is cleaner now, though fish consumption advisories remain in effect. The soil in certain areas is still contaminated, and cleanup efforts continue, slow and expensive and incomplete. There is a museum in Oak Ridge, the American Museum of Science and Energy, where visitors can learn about the Manhattan Project and the role the city played. The exhibits are educational and celebratory, emphasizing the scientific achievement and the contribution to ending the war. There are displays of calotrons and photographs of workers and a replica of Little Boy. There is less emphasis on the human cost, on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, on the displacement of families and the environmental damage, and the workers who got sick. The narrative is careful, curated, designed to inspire pride without provoking too much discomfort. But the discomfort is there, beneath the surface, in the stories that are not told in the museum, in the memories that have not been recorded, in the silences that persist. Oak Ridge is a place where history is both visible and hidden, where the past is acknowledged but not fully reckoned with. It is a place that represents both the triumph and the tragedy of American ambition, the capacity for incredible achievement, and the willingness to pay almost any price to achieve it. The workers who built Oak Ridge believed they were serving their country, and they were. They believed they were doing something important, and they were. But they were also part of a system that used them without their consent, that kept them ignorant for the sake of security, that valued the goal over the means and the outcome over the cost. They were ordinary people asked to do an extraordinary thing, and they did it without knowing what it was, and when they found out, many of them wished they hadn't. The story of Oak Ridge is not a simple story of good versus evil, of heroes and villains. It is a story of complexity and contradiction, of necessity and consequence, of the things people can do when they believe they have no choice. It is a story about secrecy and what it does to people, how it isolates and burdens and changes them. It is a story about power and who wields it and what happens to those who do not. It is a story about the distance between intention and impact, between what we think we are doing and what we are actually doing, and it is a story that is not over. The nuclear weapons built with the material from Oak Ridge still exist, thousands of them, in silos and submarines and bunkers around the world. The knowledge of how to build them cannot be unlearned. The consequences of their existence, the threat they pose, the fear they inspire, these things shape our world in ways we often do not see but always feel. Oak Ridge was the beginning of that, the place where the atomic age was born, and we are still living in the world it created. On quiet mornings when the fog rolls through the valleys and clings to the ridges, Oak Ridge looks almost peaceful. The streets are clean, the houses are well kept, children ride bicycles to school, people go to work and come home and live their lives. But if you know the history, if you know what lies beneath the ordinary surface, you cannot unsee it. You cannot forget that this place was built in secret, that 75,000 people came here and worked without knowing what they were building, that they turned dials and watched needles and recorded numbers that added up to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. You cannot forget that the government chose this land and these people and used them for a purpose they did not reveal until it was too late. You cannot forget that the cost of ending one war was the beginning of a terror that has never ended. The people who worked at Oak Ridge are mostly gone now, dead or too old to remember clearly. Their children and grandchildren carry the stories, some of them, the ones that were told, though many were not. The land carries its own stories, written in contaminated soil and buried waste and the ghosts of farms that no longer exist. And the world carries the story too, in the shadow of the bomb, in the knowledge that human beings built a weapon capable of destroying everything, and that they did it in a place that did not exist on any map, a place where people lived and worked and never knew, until it was too late, what they had done. That is the legacy of Oak Ridge. Not just the scientific achievement, not just the ending of a war, but the cost of those things, the price paid by people who did not choose to pay it and did not know they were paying it until the bill came due. It is a legacy of brilliance and horror, of patriotism and exploitation, of triumph and grief. It is a legacy that asks questions we are still trying to answer. What are we willing to sacrifice for security? What are we willing to hide for the sake of winning? What do we owe the people who do the work we cannot or will not do ourselves? And what do we owe the people who suffer the consequences of our choices? Oak Ridge does not answer those questions. It only raises them over and over in the silence of its fenced-off sites and the memories of its aging survivors and the soil that will carry contamination for thousands of years. It is a place that asks us to look at what we have done and what we are still doing and to decide whether we can live with it, whether we can live with the knowledge that we built a city in secret and asked 75,000 people to work there without telling them what they were building, and that what they built changed the world in ways we are still discovering, still grappling with, still trying to understand. That is is the story of Oak Ridge. That is the story of the invisible city, the secret city, the city that built a bomb and ended a war and began a nightmare that has no end.